Hi, my name is Robbie Diamond. I'm the CEO of Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE. Welcome to everyone for joining us here today for the release of this important paper, Fostering Economic Opportunity Through Autonomous Vehicle Technology, a very timely paper. And thanks to all our panelists for joining us. Let me introduce the organization very quickly for people who do not know us, and maybe share a couple points about the paper, and then turn it over to this esteemed panel. So SAFE was originally founded in 2004 to end oil dependence for economic and national security. And then working on this issue, we've really come to the point where technology is finally here. At that time, there was probably not enough technology to solve that problem. But right now, all the technology is here through the connected, autonomous, shared electric space. And that really has excited us. In some ways, we've changed our mission statement to enhance the nation's energy security and support our economic resurgence and resiliency by advancing these transformative transportation and mobility technologies. And really excited to look at all these technologies to help better society in so many ways. And in this paper, Fostering Economic Opportunity Through Autonomous Vehicle Technology, which we started before the pandemic, we really wanted to look, was there a way to help with economic mobility, economic upward mobility? And then with the pandemic, it just became even more important when watching all these incredible frontline workers who had to get to a job and use public transportation. So as we were working on this, it's not, in fact, against public transportation. It's just maybe better ways in thinking about it and doing it. And so we really are excited to release this now, because as the country and the world struggles to rebuild its economy, to make sure there's equality and economic opportunity, mobility is so important to that. In fact, as I said before, economic mobility is absolutely directly correlated. The number one correlation is with actual mobility. And what you see in our society is access to a private vehicle is not only positively correlated with employment, but car ownership itself also predicts higher earnings to a far greater degree than access to public transit. And in many cases, people in our society are choosing between owning a car and maybe even having an unsustainable household budget, because they have to choose between supporting this car or getting to a job and how they get to a job. Approximately 70% of regional jobs, retail, and other opportunities are now outside of downtown centers. Much of our public transit is not built currently, its legacy, to get us to those jobs. And more than 75 million households in the United States we found in doing some of our analysis, which represents approximately 2/3 of Americans live in neighborhoods that are beyond their means because of largely unseen transportation costs. They buy their home but don't factor in the transportation costs. So when they do that, with this car ownership to get to their jobs, their home then becomes sustainably unaffordable over time. And in using AV, autonomous vehicle transportation, which would also be electric, which has other environmental benefits, one could reduce household costs by as much as $5,600 per household. We found that when one looked at the estimates of autonomous electric shared transportation, they really ranged between 50 cents a mile was actually amongst the most conservatives, where public transportation in many cases is subsidized to $1.30 a mile currently. So there's opportunity to provide more free miles from our government, and maybe get benefit for both the people as well as save money for the government itself. We did a little extra research and looked at some of the employment growth areas in our modern economy. So we looked at some of the largest Amazon facilities. So the 60 largest US fulfillment centers and facilities by Amazon are essentially inaccessible to those who work there by public transportation. They have to commute by personal vehicles. And so really all these things, there's so many more facts and figures, and let the panel talk through this issue. But really, we really found that if one wants upward mobility, one needs actual mobility, and maybe there are cheaper, better mechanisms of point-to-point mobility that would both help people themselves as well as cost to the government. So for this panel, I'll just introduce Alisyn Malek, who can introduce the panelists. Alisyn Malek is our new executive director for our Commission on the Future of Mobility. We're so excited that she joined our team just months ago. She's got an incredible pedigree. She was at General Motors on the battery team of their electrical vehicle program before joining their GM Ventures and managing their pipeline. She then went on to co-found, and be the COO of May Mobility, which actually is a shared electric autonomous shuttle concept. She left there, was actually on the board of our directors, and when she left the job, I talked to her about joining to take over this commission, which we'll tell you about in the coming months. But she's our executive director, and so we're thrilled that she's moderating this panel because she's got so much hands-on experience with this issue in helping to provide this technology to meet some of these needs that I was just describing before. So thank you, Alisyn. I'll turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to this amazing panel.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for the kind introduction. Before we dive in and have the panelists each introduce themselves, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question for your panel, we are taking questions live. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat function. We'll be monitoring the Q&A and I'll be working those questions in as we get rolling. Before we dive in on the questions, though, I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves so you can understand the breadth of experience that we bring to the conversation today. So we'll start off. Courtney, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me. My name is Courtney Ehrlichman. I'm founder and CEO of the Ehrlichman Group, and we help startups, governments, and corporations navigate the fast evolving and technological advancements in the mobility industry, focused really on policy and pilots and deployments. Prior to that, I was the Deputy Executive Director at Carnegie Mellon University's Traffic 21 Institute, which also housed two national US DOT University Transportation Research Centers, where we focused on going out into the community, the transportation community, and all communities, essentially rural and urban, finding out what their transportation problems were and designing technology solutions to help solve them. I also spun a company out of the Robotics Institute there called Robotics, and I'm an avid cyclist. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you, Courtney. And Dr. Ezike, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Alisyn. My name is Dr. Richard Ezike. I currently serve as a Senior Policy Associate at the Urban Institute, where I work on a number of different projects focused on this intersection of innovation and city services. Basically, the work that we're trying to do is how do we help cities take technology and use it to help promote equity and inclusion. It's a very key component of our work. In terms of my background, I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I'm kind of new to this transportation space, but in the last 5 years, I've worked at places such as the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where I did some research on transportation sustainability and environmental justice. And then right after that, I worked at the Union Concerned Scientists on a fellowship looking at specifically AVs and their impacts on equity, particularly in the DC area. And we put out a report in February of 2019 with some research that we did on that topic. So I really quite involved and passionate about transportation and STEM education, particularly. As I mentioned, as an engineer, I did a lot of my work outside of transportation is focused on helping young men and women get into the STEM fields. So I'm quite involved with the National Black Engineers and trying to get them more into STEM and particularly transportation jobs in STEM. So I think there's, when you have more representation in this space, it helps to, bring other people and make the transportation industry much more diverse. And of course, that helps everybody. So I'm looking forward to providing my thoughts in the paper and this conversation. And thank you for having me as a panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Kornhauser.
Hi, I'm Alain Kornhauser. I guess I've been dealing with automated transportation systems to save our cities for over 50 years. I think I started in January 1970 dealing with that. That's when we thought we were going to Mars, and I was going to Mars, but we decided we weren't going to Mars, so I had to focus on something else. about to start my 49th year at Princeton as a professor, whatever. Um, um, Along the way, as a sidelight, started a company. Wife and I ran it for 33 and a half years, sort of on the side, and sold it in 2012, whatever. Led the Princeton team in the DARPA challenge. Changed my life. Never had more fun in my life than that. But I guess the real realization that came out of the DARPA challenge was, my goodness, maybe what we can do is we can work on a single car entity, put enough intelligence in it to get it to actually work, and then replicate, and not ask for anything else, not ask for infrastructure, not ask for anything else. To me, that completely changed the view here, because in all the other systems we had considered before that, you had to go beg, alms for the poor to build infrastructure to do it. This one, we didn't have to ask for that. All we had to do was put the intelligence in the vehicle. And that's what's gotten us here. And that's the opportunity that I think we're looking to deal with today, is that opportunity to provide mobility and an affordable mobility to everybody who hasn't had that opportunity up to today. Is the real opportunity for the future. And I think that that's what we'll end up discussing today.
Thank you so much. So we're going to kick off with one question sort of across the panelists, have a bit of conversation there. I've got a couple of key questions for each of the panelists based on their specific experience, but I'll also be monitoring the Q&A channel. So if you have questions that come up as we have our conversation, again, please feel free to share your questions in that channel. So to kick it off, this paper feels rather timely. There's been a lot of conversation about autonomy in the past. And now as we look at access to transportation in the era of COVID-19, the conversation is really, in my mind, just accelerated. COVID-19 has exacerbated many of the existing transportation challenges that low-income communities face. And with transit schedules being changed and suspended, and a lot of these people actually being represented in essential workforces, there are a lot of questions that we have to think about in terms of helping people get to work, and also how our communities of color are impacted as they're bearing the brunt of this disease. Can you discuss how transportation factors into this discussion, and how new transport technologies can aid in mitigating some of the risks? So Dr. Ezike, I'd love to kick off with your thoughts and then have the conversation roll from there.
Sure, thank you. I mean, you really described it very well, Alisyn. It's COVID-19 has disrupted almost everything, and how transportation plays a role in how essential workers, low-income communities of color get to their jobs. Healthcare, housing is a very key thing to think about. And we know that they disproportionately ride on transit, and we know that because transit has to cut back, upwards we're seeing almost upwards of 95% ridership drops, like we're seeing in Washington, and massive budget cuts due to loss of ridership across many agencies. We have to really think about, how are we going to get those workers? How are we going to provide services for those communities so they can get to the places that they need to go to? And transportation has had a long history when it comes to race, and we look at the Montgomery bus. We look at the Rosa Parks and her stand in Montgomery. We think about infrastructure and how it's developed many times to divide primarily Black communities and prevent them from getting access to services and building strong neighborhoods. And so over the years, we've had all these disruptions, and of course, the latest being the pandemic, which is coupled with, of course, the resulting recession, which also disproportionately affects people of color and income as well. And so I think what we need to do is, in terms of transportation's role, and really looking forward to serving these workers in a way that we're not seeing that right now. Automated technology and other new technologies could fill in those gaps in places where they're where it exists now. And I think it's very important that we look into, okay, where are those gaps? You know, how do we identify them? Who is being affected? And what are some ways that we can mitigate those gaps so that people can get access to the things they need to get to? And so I think it's a challenge for all of us in transportation space to figure out, you know, how technology and innovation plays a role in that. And, you know, I think AVs do have a role to play. But again, it's really important that we integrate them in a way that doesn't exacerbate already existing inequities. And that's something that we all need to be considered about. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Ms. Ehrlichman and Dr. Kornhauser, are there any other thoughts that you'd like to add to that? I think Dr. Ezike was pretty thorough, but if you guys have other perspectives, I think the business side of making sure that we're providing transportation is also huge as you look at the different workers that participate in providing transportation.
I would like to just add that I think, you know, we've got a great report here and a great piece of the conversation. I would really like to see employers getting into the conversation a little bit more. There's discussion about Amazon fulfillment centers and the sort of geographic mismatch between jobs and affordable housing, which you've discussed in the paper isn't really affordable when you add in, you know, transportation fees. So I think that there's a whole suite or portfolio of solutions that if they work together, you know, technology plus policy, that we can really start to align those mismatches and solve for the good of everybody.
I take a very focused view on this, and my focused view on this is that we have to get to a point in which we can offer this mobility driverlessly without an attendant. Those of us who both can afford and have decided that we want to contribute our time for free to be able to get us from A to B at the drop of a hat anytime we want with a car, we're great. Anybody who's, for whatever reason, can't do that, hasn't had the opportunity to do that, has to take a bus. Oh my goodness. The difference in those two ways of getting from A to B is just so enormous. And it's created such an uneven playing field. And so one of the reasons why is some people might not want to do it well. I mean, the reason we go from A to B is to improve our utility. It's the only reason you travel, to improve your quality of life. And you have to bear the brunt of the mobility. Some of us who get to, no problem. Others of us that there's no bus that goes there, don't even get to go. Or we don't have anybody to drive us. My goodness, there isn't just one person in the family. Why should only that one person have access to a car and be able to do it? What about the other person, the other persons? How do they get from A to B? They got to wait for the bus. Okay.
It's a very good point. Thinking about the whole household is going to be really
so in a sense, you know, what the way to do that and the way to do, I mean, we could hire a chauffeur. You know, we've always had the ability. Downton Abbey, you can have a chauffeur. Okay. But most of us don't, or many of us don't. And the only way you can get the price down, the cost, forget the price, the cost down to something that's affordable, is you have to eat the labor. There are two ways to eat the labor. You can enslave, or you can make it into a computer. Okay? Those are the two ways. We know which way is better. I think we've all decided which way is better. So you put a computer there. What can you do with a computer? The computer doesn't care who you are, doesn't care where you're going, as long as your operational design domain includes all the technical details, and doesn't care what time it is. Whereas if we're sticking with and that's real transit. Okay, it's not 20th century. It's not 20th. It's not 20th century transit where we got to wait for a bus and when somebody is available to drive the bus, and where it's going to go, that somebody put on the map. You shall stop here. You shall stop there. But the rest of it, forget you.
But as long as we're using computers, to your point, they can be democratic when designed that way, but then there's also the business model that needs to align with that. And that's where I think this conversation is really important about what are the policy steps we can make sure to take that we can have this great outcome come with the technology.
Business model is free because we have Moore's law.
It's not free though.
Look,
You gotta pay
of
for the
course
cars.
You got to
So
pay for the
actually,
cars, but the computer doesn't cost anything, and the cameras don't cost anything, and the software ends up not costing anything because once you make it once, replication cost is zero.
Well,
and so if you total that all up compared to what the heck we spend on
so
a
I'm
light rail
curious to
system.
get like,
Go ahead,
Mr. Ehrlichman,
Courtney,
with
come
your
on.
experience in terms of deploying robots, not necessarily to move people, but you've seen some of that. I'm curious to get your thoughts about this.
I would like to just sort of back up a moment too. And I think that there are other modes that people are using besides transit because they don't have access to transit. And I like Dr. Kornhauser's mention of the full household and not thinking of like the traditional 9-to-5 male commute. We're really turning towards a caretaking economy. We have a aging generation of boomers. We have, single mothers, a high statistical number of single mothers that need to not only get to a job, but get their children to daycare, go shopping, go to doctor's appointments. So we really need to make sure that our transportation system is designed for everybody, including children. So in my experience here in Pittsburgh, we actually worked with employers and low-income communities to understand what their problems were. And what we heard was that and this is actually this project was focused on female night shift workers working in the hospital industry, but we also talked to the grocery industry and the restaurant industry. And what we found is that the HR managers at those entities really struggle to keep employees because if they missed one of the 3 buses that they needed to take, more than once, they would be fired. So again, there's this mismatch between how is the services being designed and how are they being optimized? And I think there's a benefit to leveraging technology partnered with community conversation and understanding what the real needs are and solving for that. I'm not necessarily sure that we're at the level of L5 autonomy where we can have AV shuttles and that's just the solution. But we can do things like have level 3 autonomy built into transit services that enhance the quality of life for the driver, that optimize how they're moving through the neighborhoods and through bus lanes. Enhancing our infrastructure is going to be important no matter what technology we're using, whether there's no technology or we're going to be using connected technology. We really need to make sure that we're advocating for broadband everywhere, that we're making sure that the solutions that we design are data driven and not necessarily politically driven, and that we're also thinking about rural communities, not just urban communities, because that's where a lot of people are actually really isolated right now. And we know that the cost of owning a vehicle is only increasing, and the auto loan industry there's a lot of defaults right now, and it's more expensive, as you describe in the paper, for low income people to own a vehicle. So I think the goal here is right, like thinking about more density and thinking about how can we use technologies to enhance our transportation systems and really work to optimize transit as the central backbone. I definitely think that, yes, Moore's Law, things will become more and more affordable in terms of the cost of technology, but we also need to think of the cost to society. So, we need to be designing, we need to be thinking about that land use at the same time. We can't just throw computers into everything. It's not going to solve for humanity, not for society, not for, people that need to get to services, need to get food. So there's one piece of the puzzle, but there's also many others. And I think really including communities in that conversation is critical.
I think you bring up a really good point, Courtney, about thinking about the system-wide impacts. You pointed out how transit should still be at the backbone of this. And one of the questions that came through the Q&A talks about vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and what is the future going to look like if we've got autonomous vehicles going around with people commuting and packages needing to get delivered? What could the impact of VMT be? And I'd like to steer this one to Dr. Ezike to talk a little bit about congestion versus VMT and how transportation systems should think about these types of impacts as they think about launching AVs in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. This is a great question because as in the report that I talked about when I was at the Union Concerned Scientists, we looked at that specifically with VMT impacts and congestion impacts with the fully autonomous fleet. The idea of the way to go about it in the wrong way is to think about kind of maintaining the status quo, which is the single occupancy paradigm. I think nearly 8% of our commuters drive to work by themselves. I think that's according to the recent National Household Travel Survey. And doing that, if you transition to this autonomous vehicle fleet, and as Courtney mentioned, you don't think about the land use impacts, what you're going to get is significant sprawl, right? You're going to see communities and people moving out to further out of the center city. And if they're all still commuting into the city for work, then you're going to have significant travel times, more people driving VMT. But with the cost of driving pretty much eliminated, if you do go to level 5, then that's going to cause much more vehicle miles traveled, likely much more congestion because our roads aren't being expanded at the same rate as people buying their cars or driving them. So it can be a big challenge if you're really trying to focus on congestion relief and VMT reduction, which a lot of our major metropolitan cities are trying to do. So in our report, we talked about the importance of looking at encouraging carpooling again. Back in the 80s, we had about a maximum carpool rate, which is about 10%. We're down in the single digits now. So how do we look into making that something that is palpable again? And that may mean using data and other technologies to optimize trips where people start, pick people up, kind of what Uber and Lyft do with their platform, but kind of modifying that in a different way. But yeah, most of our studies are showing that VMT increases significantly. Even if you can get more cars on a specific, more cars on the road, because AVs connecting autonomous vehicles are likely communicate with each other and minimize distance between each other. You're still going to get that congestion and VMT increase. So that's something you have to consider. And then from that, and also from the environmental standpoint, which does have an equity component too, we saw in our work that many of communities, especially low-income communities of color, are likely to live near close to major roadways, and are affected by on-road pollution from the cars driving. So if all of a sudden you have these autonomous vehicles, significant increase in those, and we don't transition to an electric, powered vehicles, which you do share in your report, which is great, then you're going to see, this significant uptick in both criteria pollutants and also climate change emissions. So this focus on autonomous, shared, and electric, the 3 revolutions, as UC Davis calls it, is very important. And thinking about ways to minimize our VMT, especially within neighborhoods where a lot of that increase in VMT from AVs are going to be realized, has to be a concern as well. I mean, if you talk to EPO about that, they're when they talk about AVs, that's one of the top things they worry about is how's that going to affect congestion, how it's going to affect our vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about it's not just the vehicles. We need to think about them existing in a community, and how people are actually going to use them. And one of the questions that came through online actually brings up the Sidewalk Lab Project that came up in Toronto. This was an effort to try to bring the latest and greatest. There was efforts to bring AVs, to bring data sharing, to try to encourage more sharing, different use of modes. But the project ultimately is not going forward, in part because there were a lot of concerns from local residents around privacy and control issues. And as we look at how this technology can help, and who may end up owning that data, it becomes an interesting dialogue that we also need to have. And Ms. Ehrlichman, I'm curious to get your thoughts as you've worked on the private side and trying to support communities. I don't know if you've watched that project in particular, but this question around the data that supports all of this system optimization is going to be really critical.
Yeah, data policy is incredibly important. So if you're looking for a career, anyone on the line, go into data policy. I think one of the major things about the Sidewalk Labs project that was made me really uncomfortable was a lot of the facial recognition that was going to be sort of embedded in the community. Also, I think where that project fell on its face was the fact that it didn't really have a lot of community input, and it was designing something sort of in its own little bubble. And I think that it's absolutely a blessing that it has shut down. I admire them for trying to do something like that. It's bold, but I don't think that we want technology-driven communities. Technology is a tool, it's not the overlord. And so without defining what they were trying to solve for, I think that was a big issue. So data privacy is huge. I mean, there's a huge conversation legally right now around the mobility data specification and, you know, individual trip data that we're seeing play out with Uber and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And from my perspective, you know, in everything that I've researched and come to understand through Carnegie Mellon and the experts there is that, you know, that it is a big problem to have that individual trip data available to different parties. So we really do need to understand that and follow what's happening with that case right now. I also think that there's opportunities, if we really want to think outside the box, something that there were conversations around here in Pittsburgh during the Smart City Challenge was, how do you create a data trust that a community owns? So they actually own their own data, and if a company is interested in it, there's a way that they have to transact with that community to access it. So, you know, how can we think about that moving forward, rather than, you know, just blindly giving out our data, which we do right now. I think GDPR is starting to unpack that a little bit, and we're starting to see international companies here in the US, you're starting to see a little bit more of them being a little more cognizant of privacy and asking us about what we want to share. But we do need to be thinking about that. But we can also use this data for scenario planning. Like cities can be using this to figure out the best way to optimize, maybe during time of day, or if there's a large event, like when the Pope came to Philadelphia, you know, they actually activated their doomsday scenario. But I think if we have a lot more data coming in to road managers' feeds, we can actually start to optimize, but we just need to be careful to protect the privacy of our citizens.
And Dr. Kornhauser, I'm curious to get your take on the discussion around data as we think about, you know, if adding more computers and more cameras is free, what is the value from a business perspective? In a lot of cases, it ends up being the data. So I'm wondering if you have a perspective that you'd like to share on this.
Well, I don't put that much weight on the data myself. I don't, you know, it might be good for planning, but I'm more interested in implementation, in the real-time matchmaking that has to go on to be able to do the key element of this thing is really not technology, it's the sharing. Okay, there are vehicles that go from A to B that more than one person could get in there at that time and be really happy. The problem is we have no mechanism right now to be able to do that. Okay, the carpooling stuff doesn't do it. Why? Because you gotta set it up, you gotta do it every day, it's fixed, whatever. In the variable, nobody's exchanged information, nobody's come up with the app that my neighbors and I might share to be happily go together. None of that exists. We have not focused enough on the sharing. It's not that I get to use a vehicle and then you get to use a vehicle. No, it's that I get to use a vehicle when you want to use a vehicle at that same vehicle and we get in together. And the average vehicle occupancy, FHWA says it's 1.55. I don't believe it. in Princeton in a normal day, morning, when kids go to school, which we don't do anymore, but we did it one time, so let's go back and think about that. I think the average vehicle occupancy in Princeton was less than 1. Why? Because I took my daughter to school and drove back home. The average vehicle occupancy for that is 0.5. Okay, now sure, a driverless vehicle is going to have to do some empty vehicle shuttling to go pick up the next person. But it turns out, in my looking at the 1.2 billion trips that I think take place on a typical day across the United States, we can get to an average vehicle occupancy of 2 and have everybody have a great trip.
Yeah,
if we share the vehicle. And if we do that, then guess what? There is no congestion because it's 2 on average. So during the peak, guess what? It's 3 or more. There's no congestion on Route 1. There's no congestion in Pittsburgh. There's no congestion in Peoria. There's no congestion in LA. Okay, if we share the resource, and everything FHW and so on has always been on the vehicle. Nobody's looked at where the person wants to come from and go to the specific, and you start putting them together, you don't have to have 30 people in a bus. You have to have 3. And what Uber and Lyft did, excuse me, is an embarrassment. They didn't do anything, okay? They didn't take advantage of knowing where everybody lives, that United Airlines knows what every time a plane lands at Newark, okay? Or knowing where they live for everybody who wants to take a plane from Newark. Have they tried to make any of that information available? Or in a community who wants to go to an Amazon distribution facility in Titusville and go from Ewing, which is, a 15-minute car ride or a driverless vehicle ride that now takes an hour and 45 minutes to take with a county shuttle and the 606 bus. Come on, this improves quality of life. We need to focus on that and make that happen. That's how we get the mobility, but that's where I come from. Unfortunately, too many.
So go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, I like that you brought up sharing, and I do think that there are some transit projects out there right now that are working on that. I do think that it's a really big issue in terms of rural America solving for this. Phoenix Mobility Rising is actually working on this. I was just working with Nebraska DOT talking about these issues, and actually this week I was talking to Minnesota about this research study that came out. I think it was last month in the Transportation Research Part F, about examining human attitudes towards shared mobility options and autonomous vehicles. So it's incredibly relevant. What I would say, it's the beginning of looking at these things, and it's really deep into the weeds. But we really, again, it talks about how there's different segments of the population that have different attitudes towards sharing. So policies need to be designed around that, incentives need to be designed around that, and we really need to think about, what are their perceptions right now. I just want to mention some key things from the survey that they found. So one of the key drivers for riding in an autonomous vehicle from this survey was improved safety. The least significant was reducing traffic congestion. Some of the most desired features in autonomy were collision avoidance and improved fuel efficiency, and sort of nothing, like the driving themselves was sort of midway on that scale. So I think that, we can talk about shared, but we really need to understand again, what is society thinking about that, and how do we change behaviors in a way that solves for the plethora of issues that we're talking about, including, density, land use, cheap land, the propensity now to move out of cities because of COVID, social distancing, and a business model. So, I think we can talk about 2 people in a car, but we really want higher throughput through intersections, especially in cities. And I think the only way to do that is with larger transit vehicles. And I think, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 on smaller vehicles might make sense, feeding into the the backbone of the transit system. But again, there are issues that need to be talked through and solved for when we're doing that, not just thinking about the technology, but thinking about how people are going to utilize that technology and what their attitudes are.
I think that is a really good point about thinking about attitudes, towards sharing. We've had a couple of questions come up on the Q&A. In the era of COVID, are people really going to want to share? But even before COVID, at least in the US, the propensity for sharing was generally a little bit lower. One of the easiest ways to encourage people to share is to make it the easiest way to get around. I think one of the most successful bus routes in LA actually is the most successful because it's way faster than commuting by car. So the ridership is up. And as we think about those types of policies and incentives, I'm curious to get your thoughts in terms of thinking about AV as an enabler for hubs and spokes, looking at are there neighborhoods or even in less dense or more rural areas, are there opportunities to use AVs to kind of build out that hub to bring people towards maybe higher throughput transit?
I answer that no. I mean, I think you're wasting your time, I'll even say. Transit serves at best 4% or 4% of the trips in the nation at best. At best. It goes to where really not very many people want to go when you actually look at it as where people live. And if one wants to worry about where people are going to live post-COVID, who wants to live in a tower? I don't know.
Curious.
So therefore, my goodness, why don't look at this as an opportunity for transit to finally, it has the opportunity to have a technology that can actually meet customer demand, as opposed to a technology that says, hey, come take this, like it or not. And unfortunately, they have it. Why feed a system that really is not where people want to go? That's not where these communities want to go. It isn't. Not during the day, even to work. It's yes, Manhattan, absolutely. Of course. Yes, New Jersey Transit rail to Manhattan, of course. But what about the rest of New Jersey? What about, I grew up in Pittsburgh, okay? I used to take the streetcar, okay? All right. Darn it, on Crafton, where do people want to go? They want to go to Carnegie, okay? They don't want to go downtown. How the hell you get there? You walk.
So I'm curious, Dr. Ezike or Mr. Ehrlichman,
Sorry.
if you have a different person. No, I think this is good. It's
whatever.
Good to have multiple perspectives, but I'm curious because yes, from a human usage perspective, 2 people to a car makes it more personalized. But if you're trying to get 1,000 people headed in the same direction, we may just not have enough pavement.
But if you have people who want to go at the same time, you do it. You do it on the New York City subway system, which is about the only place where you can do that. You look at the light rail system they build in St. Louis, they can't get 1,000. I mean, what they have to do they have to pull out your nail.
I think you make a good point about communities where adoption has been slower, but I'm curious to get a perspective from Ms. Ehrlichman or Dr. Ezike about what they've been seeing in other communities as they've worked on transit and AV adoption.
And I'm happy to jump in, but I want to make space for Dr. Ezike to speak. If you have anything, I'm happy to jump in though.
Go ahead and share it, Courtney, and I'll add on to anything you may say. I'm still thinking about how to answer that question.
Okay. Okay. So I think I kind of just want to plant ourselves back in where we are today and think about how do we actually address the problems that I think this report that SAFE has prepared has clearly outlined, which is geographic mismatch between jobs and where people are living, the gross gap between transportation costs and affordable housing. It's like this false choice that people have been given, and a need to electrify our system as well for our air quality purposes. So how do we get there? We're not at level 5. We need to look at other programs that are happening right now, other pilot projects. There's an amazing one that is going to be taking off in Hartford, Connecticut, where they're going to be using automation, but not necessarily taking the driver out, but doing things like enhancing docking through automation and platform boarding. And I think those are things that we can start to do to think about how automation works on these huge transportation systems, right? I also think, to Dr. Kornhauser's point, there is a demand problem and there is a flexibility problem with transit. Not necessarily a problem, but a need. So again, here in Pittsburgh on the Forward City of Tomorrow project, we were looking at night shift workers and the fact that there just isn't transit at certain hours of the evening when they're getting off of work, or they have to wait outside at a bus stop where they don't feel comfortable. So how can we think about serving those needs in a way that also enhances transit for everybody? I just want to put it out there because it hasn't been touched upon, is thinking about our actual infrastructure again as a market, right? Like think about the road as a market. Right now, it's been completely subsidized and is leaning towards car dominance. A way to decrease the need for automobile dominance is to create other ways and that are more efficient, like you were talking about, Alisyn, to get around. So let's create more spaces for transit, shared vehicles, whether they be, operated by transit, but also thinking about multimodal solutions. E-bikes are taking off right now. And while that is not the silver bullet, it's one piece of the puzzle. And it can help empower people that are living in communities that are disconnected. It can also enhance their health. And we need to give safe passage for those vehicles. There's also scooters. We really need to start thinking about family mobility a lot more across all of the modes. But how are we actually pricing the road? And how are we looking at it as a market? And how are we getting the amount of people that we need to through it and over it? So it's a geometry question. It's an economy question. There's some game theory in there, but we really need to be looking at that as well. Not just, one vehicle type, but all of them and how can they work in unison to solve these problems.
Yeah, and I'd like to add onto that. It's also a workforce issue as well. A lot of the discussion that I've been hearing, especially for those who are skeptical about AVs, is the impact on the workforce. I believe there was a report that came out by the Center for Global and Policy Solutions called 6 Smart, I believe, and basically they were saying how because, and this, I think this relates to the equity issue, that a lot of the jobs that can be replaced by AVs are dominated by people of color, specifically Black and brown communities. And so trying to figure out this balance, right, between moving to a car dominated AV structure, but also thinking about the job displacement that's going to happen because of that, and especially focusing on those people that we're talking about in the report. How do we find that balance? How do we can encourage the adoption of technology, the ability to get to people in a more efficient way? AVs may play a part in that, but we also have to consider what is the workforce displacement and what are the challenges in getting either training or replacing, or if that's where we go in that direction, or as you mentioned, moving them into different modes, whether it's working in scooters or dockless bikes or other modes. I think it's all about, again, a multimodal system, as Courtney so aptly mentioned. That's very important to serve as the backbone for our transportation system, and not so much looking at AVs as kind of the panacea to, and their ability to get from point A to point B. It's not as straightforward as that, in my opinion.
So I think you bring up a good point about, jobs and access to them. One of the questions that actually came up through the Q&A is about police involvement in traffic enforcement. And that has many implications that the nation is, and actually globally we're talking about now, in terms of community safety. And I'm curious if any of you have a view as to how autonomous vehicles and the increased safety potentially in transportation could create more opportunity, taking people away from traffic enforcement, and maybe having them work more directly with the community. Curious if any of you have thoughts on that opportunity.
I guess I do.
Yeah.
I think that it's a real shame that we have police officers with guns passing out traffic tickets to reduce misbehavior by people who drive cars. You know, we don't have Bonnie and Clyde out there anymore. Okay.
Yeah, and I can actually give a real world.
Let me finish. Please let me finish. Okay.
Absolutely.
We don't. And in fact, if you look at the misbehavior that takes place on the roadways, my goodness, you know, the chance that that thing can escalate into something else. I have a broken taillight. The Princeton police searched to see if there's a warrant out for my arrest because I didn't pay for the previous ticket that I got for my broken taillight. And so they arrest me. Why didn't I pay for the broken taillight? Maybe I couldn't afford it. Maybe I chose to eat because I had to have a car because nobody provides mobility for me. And the only way I made it palatable economically was to get a junker that had a broken taillight. How did we get here? I mean, that is just
here with
wrong.
policy, but
that
I
is just wrong. Sorry.
It is wrong, but we got here with policy, and one of the great, I think, opportunities right now as we think about how these new technologies could be deployed is that we get to rethink some of the assumptions we've made about previous policy.
Sure. So we put automated vehicles out there.
5 minutes left.
Yeah. No. Well, then you opened up a can of worms.
Yep,
I mean, you opened the can. I didn't open it. So
I kind of want to plant it back in reality. So here in Pittsburgh, there's a gentleman named Leon Ford who was shot at a routine traffic stop and paralyzed. He actually ran for council a few years later. I was working on an event where I happened to meet him. We were both talking about different aspects of our work, and we started to have a very interesting conversation about how, you know, autonomous vehicles, if they are, you know, out on the roads, how that could prevent those incidents from happening, because it sort of takes away the human element of, you know, racial profiling and all of the racial discrimination and injustice that happens through police enforcement. I also think that we have technologies that can do that right now too. We can look at speed cameras that are really, you know, I know some people push back on them because they think it's just a revenue source, but now we actually can start talking about that as a way to dismantle racial injustice in our transportation system. So I do think, you know, Alisyn, there are technologies out there now, and we can continue to leverage technologies to start to tackle that in a real way. And I'm really just glad that the conversation is now happening and we can actually start doing something about it. So I appreciate that question.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's a really important one to help highlight, outside of AVs, what are some opportunities that we have to improve the roads for everybody and making it safe to travel for everyone.
They're not going to speed. They're not going to go through red lights. They won't have broken tail lights and everything else. So of course, yes.
We're going to go over a few minutes. So for those of you listening in, if you have to dive off at 3, we will have the recording available. But I want to wrap up with one question that kind of brings us back to really one of the key recommendations from the study is to look at how do we actually encourage pilots that keep equity and access in the frame of success measurement as they are considered by different communities and by different government agencies. And so the question I'd love each of you to hit on to wrap us up today is what do you think are the best approaches for public-private policies to help address equity? Are there key metrics or communities that you think need to be talked to, or different ways to structure it? I would love to get your thoughts, and that'll be our wrap-up question today. We'll start with you, Dr. Ezike. You've been more quiet.
I've been thinking a lot. This has been a great conversation. I've been great to be a part of this with Dr.
That's been
very enlightening. And I would say to the private partnerships and then being successful, you brought up a great point, Alisyn, about community engagement. It's interesting in that, when it comes to community engagement, I think of it as in two ways. One, there's got to be the education piece of it. Some people have no idea what an automated car can do, how it functions, and whether it's safe or not. People need to, if we're going to move in this direction, people need to understand what these cars can do. What are some of the benefits? What are some of the challenges that have to be overcome? And then once they get that education, once they understand how these vehicles operate and how they are integrated into the transportation system, they need to be brought into the conversation regarding how they're going to be implemented. And it needs to be with their needs and their concerns in mind at the forefront. There are ways to define, transportation equity. You can look at work that's done by people like Todd Littman at the Victoria Transport Institute, who's done some great work on that. Policy Links Transportation Equity Caucus takes transportation equity as a key point in their work, and sometimes technology is not something they support if it's implemented in a way that continues the status quo. So when I'm thinking about community engagement, I think that's the very key part is the education piece, understanding how these vehicles work for these communities, and then making sure that they're in the conversations to give them what they are specifically looking for in terms of access and opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Kornhauser, as we think about pilots and public-private partnerships.
Well, to me, what I think is really important is for those that are developing these systems, the Waymos of this world, they need to do operational design domains, not just in Mountain View and not just in Chandler, Arizona, but they need to come to Trenton, New Jersey. They need to come where actually people who can really use the mobility, who don't have, 4 cars and 2 drivers in their family, who really can use the mobility and prove it out there and do it for the people who can really benefit from the mobility. So to me, it's more a call out to those that are doing it. Why? They're the ones with the money. They're the ones that have the investment. Washington doesn't have any money. Okay, the state of New Jersey doesn't have any money. New Jersey Transit is broke. But they do. And why not provide the mobility in the communities that actually can enhance the quality of life, can let people go to a blue collar job and feed their families, that can really improve their lives, that they'll cherish and use. Nobody's doing it in downtown San Francisco. Are you kidding me? Who cares? They're so damn rich. Come on, let them take their chauffeur. Never mind.
Thank you. Ms. Ehrlichman?
Yeah, so I think right now what we can be doing is thinking about what level of autonomy that we're at, what the needs of the communities are. There's a big conversation about food deserts and food delivery robots and how, they're sort of moving ahead forward past these other AV developments in terms of on-road robo-taxis or whatever those business models might be, which have not been proven. We're seeing these other use cases that are really fascinating and can help, at least at this point, connect communities to resources like food, which is essential. So I think we should be glad about that. I also think that we can be using autonomy to enhance the quality of life, again, for the drivers, right? Like that's a huge part of our community. And also in terms of having community involvement, we need to start by asking, what is the problem that we're solving? And then what is the right technology to solve that problem? Because Waymo may not be the solution for every single community across the country. And we know that they're in those places right now because that's their lab and they're still proving it out. And we actually need some things right now in the interim before this, world of AVs, which will be, probably another 30 to 40 years out if we're lucky. So really thinking about the incremental opportunities, having pilots and having really strong indicators. So finding out, what is that problem and measuring how it's being resolved over the course of time. I think that's critical.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank each of our panelists today. This was a great conversation. I would also like to thank everybody that participated by listening in and asking questions. We had a ton of great questions come through. I apologize, we didn't have enough time to answer them all today, so thank you. But this is really the first step. The next step for SAFE is to work on continuing to educate people on this issue so we can identify what are the opportunities that exist to help solve these inequities. Right now, there's not enough knowledge, and trying to tie together the opportunities that new technologies bring in order to have a better impact on and provide better social benefits is important. So we will continue with our work in research and make sure that we are sharing the insights that we came from this paper on the Hill. I recommend that everybody that listened in today actually check it out. It's up on our webpage, secureenergy.org. You'll find it there. And know that we will be out carrying those findings to all that will listen so we can help to really change the conversation in how autonomy can help to foster economic opportunity. Thank you again, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you.